In this segment, we are going to look at the activity-based costing method of allocating overhead cost. Recall, we have discussed in prior videos that overhead can be assigned to production using three different methods: a single plant-wide overhead rate, a departmental overhead rate, or as we will discuss in this segment, activity-based costing. When using activity-based costing, the first step is always to accumulate all of the indirect overhead costs, which we group into this cost pool. The traditional method would have taken those overhead costs and allocated them using one predetermined overhead rate to our cost objects. The departmental overhead rate would have first allocated these to a department, and then each department would have allocated to the three products. Activity-based costing will instead first take these overhead costs and identify the different activities that are driving those costs. And it then regroups those overhead costs into a cost pool for each activity that is driving the indirect cost. Once we have a cost pool for each activity, an overhead rate is calculated for each activity cost pool. And then each activity cost pool uses its predetermined overhead rate to allocate to the cost objects. Here we have three activity cost pools. Each cost object or each product will receive an allocation from each cost pool. To summarize, there are 4 steps to apply activity-based costing. First, identify the activities and accumulate the costs they cause into groupings, which we call cost pools. One cost pool for each activity. Then for each cost pool, we will assign overhead costs to the cost pools. And then we determine an activity rate or a predetermined overhead rate for each activity. Once we have a predetermined overhead rate, we assign those costs to the cost objects. Looking at an example, ABC has accumulated their total indirect cost. They have $4 million of indirect labor costs and $800,000 of factory utilities. Their total indirect costs to produce their products are $4.8 million. The total $4.8 million overhead costs and broke them out into these 4 different production activities. And for each of those production activities, they identified an activity that is driving those costs. Craftsmanship activity is driven by direct labor hours. Setup activity costs are driven by the number of batches. Design modification overhead costs are driven by the number of designs. And plant services costs are driven by the number of square feet. So now we need to calculate a predetermined overhead rate for each of those cost pools. Recall that to calculate a predetermined overhead rate, we take the total estimated cost and divide by the total estimate of the activity, or the cost driver. We allocated $600,000 of indirect costs to craftsmanship, divide by 30,000 direct labor hours, which is the estimate of the total activity, predetermined overhead rate of $20 per direct labor hour. We do the same for each cost pool. Total indirect costs or total estimated costs for that activity cost pool, divide by the total activity cost driver to calculate a predetermined overhead rate for each cost pool. Now that we have a predetermined overhead rate, we have 4 cost pools, we have 4 predetermined overhead rates. Now we need to assign the overhead cost to our cost objects. We have 2 products that we are assigning costs to, and we have 4 cost pools, which means each product is going to receive 4 allocations. We are first going to assign craftsmanship cost to product A. Product A, 25,000 direct labor hours were used. The allocation rate for this cost pool is $20 per direct labor hour. $500,000 is allocated to the craftsmanship. $500,000 is allocated to product A for craftsmanship overhead cost. We do the same thing for the setup cost pool. Product A incurred 40 batches. The predetermined overhead rate is $10,000 per batch, allocating $400,000 in indirect costs to product A for setup indirect costs. Design modification. Product A had 0 design. Thus, it is allocated none of the design modification indirect costs. Because it didn't use any of that activity, it doesn't get any of those costs. Plant services is the final cost pool. 12,000 square feet were used by product A at a predetermined overhead rate for that cost pool of $50 per square foot. $600,000 will be allocated to product A. Total indirect costs allocated to product A under activity-based costing, $1.5 million. We would then need to go through the same process to allocate indirect costs to the other product. 4 cost pools, 4 predetermined overhead rates, 4 allocations to that product. The actual number of activities used times the predetermined overhead rate for each cost pool. Thus, using activity-based costing, we allocated $1.5 million in total overhead costs to product A and $3.3 million to product B. Dividing by the number of units produced, we end up with an overhead cost per unit for product A and product B. Activity-based costing has many advantages. It is more accurate overhead cost allocation. It is more accurate because it acknowledges the fact that overhead costs are driven by more than one activity. It is more effective overhead cost control, making managers more aware of what's driving their overhead costs, allowing managers to focus on relevant factors that they can do to mitigate the amount of indirect costs by better managing activities. And it can assist in distinguishing what activities are adding value to a product and what are not. The disadvantage to activity-based costing is that it is costly to implement and maintain, and there are uncertainties with decisions that remain, such as how to group and divvy up the indirect costs into cost pools, and how to identify activity drivers for each cost pool.